I never believed in supernatural nonsense until that October night in 2019. Even now, 3 years later, I still wake up in cold sweats, my heart hammering against my ribs as phantom sounds echo through my memory. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because every detail matters when you're trying to convince someone that what happened to me was real. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. After months of grinding through 60-hour work weeks, my doctor had practically ordered me to take some time off. "You're going to have a breakdown if you don't slow down, Sarah," she'd warned me during my last visit. "Find somewhere quiet. Disconnect from everything." That's how I found myself driving up a winding dirt road deep in the Cascade Mountains of Oregon, my Honda Civic bouncing over potholes and rocks as towering Douglas firs pressed in on both sides. The cabin I'd rented through an obscure website belonged to an elderly man named Ernest Whitmore, who'd inherited it from his grandfather. The photos online showed a rustic but well-maintained structure with a stone fireplace, a wraparound porch, and what looked like miles of forest in every direction. Perfect for someone who wants to get away from it all, Ernest had told me over the phone when I called to confirm the booking. His voice carried the weathered quality of someone who'd spent decades breathing mountain air. "Haven't had a renter in almost 2 years, but everything should be in working order. Just remember, cell service is spotty up there, and the nearest neighbor is about 8 miles down the mountain." I should have paid more attention to that warning. The drive took longer than expected. What should have been a 3-hour journey from Portland stretched into nearly 5 hours as I navigated increasingly narrow mountain roads. The GPS signal died somewhere around mile marker 47, leaving me to follow handwritten directions that Ernest had emailed me. Turn left at the lightning-struck pine. Right at the old mining equipment. Straight through the clearing where the wildflowers grow. By the time I finally spotted the cabin through the trees, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The structure looked exactly like the photos, a single-story log cabin with a green metal roof and that promised wraparound porch. Smoke curled from the chimney, which I found odd since I'd specifically been told the place would be empty. I parked beside a small shed and grabbed my duffel bag from the trunk. The silence hit me immediately. After years of living in the city, where there's always some background hum of traffic or conversation or machinery, the absolute quiet of the deep woods felt almost oppressive. The only sounds were my footsteps on the gravel driveway and the distant whisper of wind through pine needles. A manila envelope was tucked under a flower pot by the front door, just as Ernest had promised. Inside, I found 2 keys and a handwritten note. "Sarah, welcome to the cabin. The larger key is for the front door, smaller one for the shed. Firewood is stacked on the north side. If you need anything, there's a landline in the kitchen, though the connection can be temperamental during storms. Hope you enjoy your stay. E. Whitmore. P.S. Don't mind the sounds at night. The forest is full of life, and old cabins creak and settle. Nothing to worry about." I read that postscript 3 times, feeling the first small prickle of unease. Why would he specifically mention sounds at night unless there was something to be concerned about? The front door opened with a satisfying click, revealing an interior that was both cozy and spotless. Exposed wooden beams ran across the ceiling, and the promised stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room. A fire was already crackling in the grate, which explained the smoke I'd seen from outside. The furniture was simple but comfortable, a worn leather sofa, a wooden coffee table scarred with decades of use, built-in bookshelves lined with paperbacks and board games. Through an archway, I could see a compact kitchen with yellow walls and vintage appliances that looked like they'd been carefully maintained since the 1970s. A narrow hallway led to what I assumed was the bedroom and bathroom. Everything was exactly as advertised, clean and welcoming. So why did I feel like I was being watched? I set my bag down and walked to the front window, pulling aside gingham curtains to peer out at the darkening forest. Nothing moved among the trees except shadows that lengthened and shifted as the sun continued its descent. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on me, studying my every movement. "You're being ridiculous," I said aloud, and immediately regretted it. My voice sounded small and foreign in the cabin's stillness, and it seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. I busied myself with settling in, unpacking my clothes into the bedroom's pine dresser and exploring the kitchen's contents. Ernest had stocked the refrigerator with basics: milk, eggs, bread, some deli meat. The pantry held canned goods and dry staples. A bottle of local wine sat on the counter with another note, "For your first night. Cheers to peace and quiet. EW." By the time I'd made myself a simple dinner of grilled cheese and tomato soup, full darkness had fallen outside. The windows now reflected the cabin's interior back at me, turning the glass into black mirrors that made the space feel smaller and more enclosed. I drew all the curtains and settled onto the sofa with my meal and a glass of wine. The fire crackled pleasantly, and I began to feel the tension in my shoulders finally starting to ease. This was exactly what I needed: no emails, no conference calls, no urgent deadlines. Just me, a good book, and the simple pleasure of doing absolutely nothing. That's when I heard the first sound. It came from somewhere outside, to the left of the cabin, a low, rhythmic scraping, like something being dragged across the ground. I set down my wine glass and listened intently, but the sound had already stopped. Probably just a branch falling, I told myself. Or maybe a deer scratching against a tree. I picked up my book again, but I'd lost my place and couldn't concentrate on the words. The fire seemed suddenly too loud, its crackling and popping masking other sounds that might be coming from outside. I found myself straining to hear past it, my ears practically aching with the effort. There it was again, that scraping sound, definitely coming from the left side of the cabin. This time it was accompanied by something else, a soft rhythmic thumping that made me think of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. I stood up slowly, my heart beginning to beat faster. Every instinct told me to investigate, to peek through the curtains and see what was out there. But a deeper, more primitive part of my brain screamed warnings. Don't look. Don't draw attention to yourself. Pretend you didn't hear anything. The sound stopped again, leaving only the fire's crackling and the sudden awareness of my own breathing. I tried to rationalize what I'd heard. This was wilderness, after all. Animals moved through these woods constantly: deer, elk, maybe even bears. The scraping could have been anything. A raccoon dragging some found treasure. A porcupine waddling through the underbrush. The mountains were full of perfectly ordinary explanations for perfectly ordinary sounds. But as I stood there in the firelight, listening to the silence, I couldn't convince myself that what I'd heard was ordinary at all. The scraping came again, longer this time, accompanied by that rhythmic thumping. And now I could hear something else, a low, almost subsonic humming that seemed to vibrate through the cabin's walls. It was barely audible, more felt than heard, but it raised the hair on my arms and made my teeth ache. I forced myself to walk to the kitchen window and lift one corner of the curtain. The glass was cold against my fingertips as I pressed my face close to peer out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but black forest, tree trunks barely visible as darker shadows against the night. But as my eyes adjusted, I began to make out details. There was definitely something moving out there. It was large, much larger than any deer or bear I'd ever seen. The shape was wrong too tall, too angular, moving with a strange, jerky gait that didn't match any animal I knew. As I watched, transfixed with growing horror, it passed between two trees about 50 yards from the cabin, and for just a moment, I caught a glimpse of its silhouette against the slightly lighter sky. It was walking upright. I dropped the curtain and stepped back so quickly that I nearly tripped over my own feet. My heart was hammering now, and my hands shook as I reached for my phone. No signal, of course. Ernest had warned me about that. The landline then. I needed to call someone, anyone, report what I'd seen. But report what, exactly? That I'd glimpsed a tall shape in the woods? That I'd heard some scraping sounds? Even to me, it sounded like the paranoid ramblings of a city dweller spooked by her first night in the wilderness. I made my way to the kitchen and picked up the ancient rotary phone mounted on the wall. The receiver was heavy in my hand, and when I lifted it to my ear, I heard nothing but silence. No dial tone, no static, nothing. The line was completely dead. The scraping sound came again, closer now, definitely on the left side of the cabin. It was followed by a new sound, a slow, deliberate knocking. 3 measured raps against the cabin's exterior wall. Thump. 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 I stood frozen in the kitchen, the dead phone still pressed to my ear, as the knocking repeated. Same rhythm, same spacing, as if whatever was out there was following some kind of protocol. Thump. 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 The sound moved along the wall, heading toward the front of the cabin. I could track its progress by the soft scraping that accompanied each sequence of knocks. Whatever was making the sound was working its way around the perimeter of the building, methodically testing each section of wall. I forced myself to move, to think clearly despite the adrenaline flooding my system. The front door, I needed to make sure it was locked. The deadbolt was already thrown, but I checked it anyway, my fingers fumbling with the cold metal. The windows too, I went from room to room, verifying that each latch was secure. As I reached the bedroom window, the knocking came again, now from the back of the cabin. The sound was directly on the other side of the wall from where I stood, so close that I could feel the vibration through the wooden planks. Thump. 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 I pressed my back against the far wall and stared at the curtained window, half expecting to see the fabric move as something brushed against the glass. But the curtains hung still, and after a long moment, the knocking moved on, continuing its circuit around the building. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear, maybe, investigating the cabin? But bears didn't knock in measured sequences. A person, then, but who would be wandering through the forest at night, miles from the nearest road? And why would they be methodically testing the walls instead of simply coming to the front door? The knocking reached the front of the cabin again, and this time it stopped directly at the door. I crept back to the main room and positioned myself where I could see the entrance without being visible from the windows. The deadbolt gleamed in the firelight, and I found myself staring at it with desperate intensity, as if I could secure it more firmly through sheer force of will. Thump. 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 The sound was so close now that it seemed to echo through my chest. I could hear the door shudder slightly with each impact, and I realized that whatever was out there wasn't just knocking, it was testing the door's strength. The knocking stopped. For several minutes, I heard nothing but the fire and my own ragged breathing. Maybe it had moved on. Maybe it was just an animal after all, one that had grown tired of investigating the strange structure in its territory. Then came a new sound from the front porch, the slow, deliberate creak of wooden boards under significant weight. Something was walking back and forth out there, pacing like a caged predator. The footsteps were heavy and measured, definitely bipedal, and definitely larger than any human. I could hear it testing the porch railing, the scraping of what might have been claws against wood. Then came a sound that made my blood freeze, a low, rumbling vocalization that was almost like speech but not quite human. It rose and fell in patterns that seemed almost conversational, as if whatever was out there was trying to communicate. The sound went on for several minutes, varying in pitch and rhythm but maintaining that unsettling quality of almost language. It reminded me of nothing so much as someone trying to speak through a mouth not designed for human speech. Then, silence. I waited, counting my heartbeats, straining to hear any sign of movement on the porch. Nothing. The night had returned to its previous stillness, broken only by the fire's crackling and the distant whisper of wind through the trees. Slowly, carefully, I made my way to the front window and lifted the corner of the curtain. The porch was empty, washed in pale moonlight that had broken through the cloud cover. I could see the wooden boards, the railing, the two rocking chairs that had been there when I arrived. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. But I knew what I'd heard. I spent the rest of the night on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket, feeding logs to the fire and jumping at every sound. The cabin settled and creaked around me, each groan of wood and whisper of wind making me tense with expectation. But the methodical knocking didn't return, and neither did that disturbing almost speech. By the time dawn began to filter through the curtains, I'd almost convinced myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. Stress, exhaustion, too much wine, any of those could have caused auditory hallucinations. The human mind was remarkably good at creating monsters out of ordinary sounds, especially in unfamiliar environments. I made coffee and opened the front door to let in the morning air. The forest looked completely benign in the daylight, all dappled sunshine and green shadows. Birds sang in the trees, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the cheerful babble of a stream. It was impossible to imagine anything sinister in such a peaceful scene. That's when I saw the marks. They were in the soft earth beside the porch steps, deep gouges that definitely hadn't been there the day before. At first glance, they looked almost like footprints, but the proportions were all wrong. Too long, too narrow, with what appeared to be claw marks at one end. And they were huge, easily twice the size of my own feet. I followed the tracks around the perimeter of the cabin, my coffee growing cold in my hands as I mapped the exact route I'd heard the knocking take the night before. The prints were clearest in the muddy areas, becoming fainter on harder ground, but the pattern was unmistakable. Something had indeed circled the building, pausing at regular intervals, exactly where I'd heard the methodical thumping. At the back of the cabin, I found something else that made my stomach lurch. 3 parallel scratches had been carved deep into the wooden siding, starting about 7 feet off the ground and dragging down nearly to the foundation. The marks were fresh, showing bright wood where bark had been stripped away. They were positioned exactly where I'd heard the knocking the night before. I dropped my coffee mug, barely noticing as it shattered on the porch steps. Whatever had visited the cabin wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was real, it was large, and it had claws capable of carving through solid wood. I should have left then. Every rational instinct screamed at me to pack my bag, get in my car, and drive back to Portland as fast as the mountain roads would allow. But something kept me rooted in place, a mixture of curiosity and stubborn disbelief that wouldn't let me accept what I was seeing. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe a bear with an unusual gait, made to seem larger and more threatening by darkness and fear. Maybe local teenagers playing pranks on isolated renters. Maybe even the cabin's owner, testing my nerves for reasons I couldn't fathom. I spent the morning researching on my laptop, using the last of my phone's battery to search for information about large animals in the Oregon Cascades. Black bears, certainly, though they rarely grew to the size indicated by the tracks I'd found. There were rumors of cougar sightings, but mountain lions didn't leave prints like the ones outside my cabin. Some hiking forums mentioned Sasquatch encounters, but I dismissed those as the fantasies of people who'd spent too much time alone in the wilderness. By afternoon, I'd almost talked myself into staying another night. The marks could be explained, the sounds rationalized. I was a grown woman with a master's degree in engineering, not some superstitious child afraid of monsters in the dark. Whatever had visited the cabin the night before, it was a flesh and blood creature that could be understood and, if necessary, dealt with. I spent the day exploring the immediate area around the cabin, partly to familiarize myself with the terrain and partly to look for any other signs of my nocturnal visitor. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, full of towering evergreens and carpeted with ferns and moss. A small stream ran about a quarter-mile to the east, and I found a game trail that seemed to lead toward higher ground. But I also found more tracks. They appeared sporadically along the stream bank and in muddy patches throughout the forest. Always the same elongated shape, always the same claw marks, always suggesting something far larger than any known animal in the region. The tracks seemed to follow no particular pattern, crisscrossing through the trees as if their maker had been wandering aimlessly. Or searching for something. As evening approached, I made my decision. I would stay one more night, but this time I'd be prepared. I moved a heavy dresser in front of the bedroom window and made sure every entrance was securely locked. I built up the fire and positioned myself on the sofa with a clear view of both the front door and the kitchen. A heavy poker from the fireplace set lay within easy reach, and I'd charged my phone as much as possible using the cabin's ancient electrical system. Most importantly, I'd rigged a simple early warning system. Using pots and pans from the kitchen, I'd created a line of noisemakers along the front porch and around the side of the cabin where the scratches had been made. If anything approached the building, I'd hear it coming. Darkness fell with the same sudden completeness as the night before, and I settled in to wait. The fire crackled pleasantly, and for the first few hours, everything remained quiet. I began to think that my preparations had been unnecessary, that whatever had visited the cabin the previous night had moved on to other territories. Then, around 11 o'clock, I heard the first clatter of displaced cookware. Something had triggered my early warning system on the left side of the cabin. The sound was followed immediately by that familiar scraping, closer and more distinct than before. My visitor had returned, and this time it seemed less cautious about making noise. I gripped the fire poker and listened as the disturbance moved around the perimeter of the building. Pots rattled and pans clanged as whatever was out there pushed through my makeshift alarm system. But instead of the methodical pattern I'd heard the night before, the sounds were erratic, almost frantic. The scraping grew louder, punctuated by new sounds, a wet, snuffling noise like something breathing heavily through its nose, and occasional low rumbles that might have been growls. Whatever was circling the cabin seemed agitated, possibly even angry. Then came the knocking again, but this time it was different. Instead of the measured thump 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 from the night before, The impacts were rapid and forceful, as if something was pounding on the walls with increasing desperation. Thump 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 thump. The sound moved quickly around the cabin's perimeter, no longer pausing to test each section of wall. The pounding was so violent that I could see dust falling from the ceiling beams, and the windows rattled in their frames. Thump 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 thump. It reached the front door and stopped. For a moment, there was silence except for that heavy, wet breathing sound. Then something began to work at the door handle. I could hear it clearly, the metallic clicking and scraping of claws or fingers trying to manipulate the latch. The handle turned slightly, stopped by the deadbolt, then rattled as whatever was outside tested the door's resistance. The scratching at the handle went on for several minutes, growing more frantic as the mechanism refused to yield. Then came a new sound that made my heart stop, the sharp, splintering crack of wood under tremendous pressure. The door frame was beginning to give way. I fumbled for my phone and somehow managed to activate the camera, though my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the device. If I was going to die tonight, at least there would be evidence of what killed me. The splintering sounds grew louder, accompanied by what I can only describe as frustrated growling. Through the door, I could hear that wet breathing, closer now, as whatever was outside pressed against the barrier between us. Then, impossibly, came the sound I'd been dreading most of all, a voice. "Let me in." The words were distorted, as if spoken through a mouth not designed for human language, but they were unmistakably English. The voice was deep, rougher than any human throat could produce, but the meaning was clear. "Let me in," it repeated, and now I could hear something else in the tone, not just demand, but pleading. Whatever was outside wasn't just trying to break in. It was asking for permission. "Please," the voice continued, each word seeming to cost tremendous effort. "So cold. So tired. Please let me in." I pressed myself against the back wall of the main room, the fire poker clutched in both hands, as the voice continued its disturbing monologue. The words came slowly, with long pauses between them, as if the speaker was translating from some other language in its mind. "I see you," it said, and my blood turned to ice. "I see the light. I see you moving. Please. I just want to be warm." The door frame gave another crack, and I could see a thin line of darkness appearing between the door and the jamb. Whatever was outside was incredibly strong, strong enough to slowly tear apart the cabin's entrance despite the heavy deadbolt. "I won't hurt you," the voice promised, and there was something almost childlike in its tone now. "I just want to come inside. I just want to be warm. It's so cold out here. So dark." Part of me, the part that had been trained to help others, to show compassion for those in need, actually considered opening the door. The voice sounded so lost, so desperate. But every instinct I possessed screamed warnings. Whatever was outside might be able to mimic human speech, but it wasn't human. The tracks, the scratches, the impossible size and strength, nothing about this situation was normal or safe. The door frame gave way with a sound like a gunshot, and suddenly the front door was hanging open, cold night air rushing into the cabin. But the doorway was empty. I could see nothing but darkness beyond the threshold, though I could still hear that heavy breathing somewhere just outside the circle of firelight. "Thank you," the voice said, much closer now. "Thank you for letting me in." I hadn't let it in. The door had simply failed under the pressure. But I didn't have time to contemplate the distinction because something was moving in the darkness beyond the doorway. I could see it at the very edge of the light, a tall, angular shape that seemed to shift and waver as if it couldn't quite decide what form to take. "Don't be afraid," it said, and now I could see where the voice was coming from. The shape in the doorway had something that might have been a head, though it was the wrong size and sat at an odd angle on what might have been shoulders. "I won't hurt you. I just want to be warm." It took a step into the cabin, and for the first time, I got a clear look at what had been stalking me. It was tall, at least 7 feet, with proportions that were almost human but subtly wrong in every detail. Its limbs were too long, its joints bent at angles that shouldn't have been possible. What I had taken for a head was actually a rough approximation of one, featuring dark hollows where eyes should have been and a gash that might have been a mouth. But the most disturbing thing about it was its skin. In the firelight, I could see that its entire body was covered in what looked like bark or rough wood, as if it had been carved from a tree trunk by someone with only a vague idea of human anatomy. And yet it moved with fluid grace, each step perfectly balanced despite its impossible proportions. "The fire is nice," it said, taking another step into the room. "I remember fire. I remember being warm." I raised the poker, though I knew it would be useless against something so large and strange. "Stay back," I managed to say, surprised that my voice worked at all. The thing that looked like a man made of wood tilted its head at an angle no human neck could achieve. "You're afraid," it observed, and there was something like sadness in its distorted voice. "I don't want you to be afraid. I just want to remember what it was like." What was like? I heard myself ask, though every instinct told me not to engage with this thing in conversation. "Being human," it replied, and the simple honesty in those words hit me like a physical blow. "I was human once. I think I was. It's hard to remember." It moved closer to the fire, and in the improved light, I could see more details that made my skin crawl. What I had taken for bark was actually human skin, but wrong somehow, as if it had been stretched and twisted until it resembled tree bark. And the dark hollows I'd thought were empty eye sockets actually contained something that glittered wetly in the firelight. "I lived in a cabin like this," it continued, lowering itself into a crouch near the hearth. "I think I did. There was a fire, and books, and coffee. I remember the smell of coffee." Despite my terror, I found myself listening, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. This thing claimed to have been human once, but that was impossible. Wasn't it? "What happened to you?" I asked, keeping the poker raised but no longer advancing. The thing's approximation of a head turned toward me, and I saw something that might have been recognition in those wet, dark hollows. "I got lost," it said simply. "I went walking in the woods, and I got lost. I walked and walked, but I couldn't find my way back. I was so cold, so hungry. And then I found them." "Found who?" "The others. The ones who live in the deep woods. They were like me once, lost, afraid, desperate. They said they could help me. They said they could make sure I never got cold again, never got hungry again. They said I could become part of the forest, part of something bigger and older than human understanding." The thing stretched out what might have been a hand toward the fire, and I saw that its fingers were too long, ending in dark points that could have been claws or thorns. "But they didn't tell me what I would lose," it continued, and now there was definite anguish in its voice. "They didn't tell me that I would forget how to be human. They didn't tell me that I would become something that frightens the very people I once was." I found myself lowering the poker slightly. Whatever this thing was, it seemed more sad than threatening now. But I didn't trust the feeling. Predators were often skilled at appearing harmless when it suited them. "How long have you been like this?" I asked. "Time doesn't work the same way in the deep woods," it replied. "Seasons pass, but they blur together. I think it's been a very long time. Long enough that I'm forgetting what it was like to be warm, to be full, to be human." It stood up again, towering over me in the firelight, and I tensed. "That's why I came here," it said. "When I saw the lights, smelled the fire, I remembered. I thought maybe if I could just sit by a fire again, talk to another person, maybe I could remember how to be human." "But you can't," I said, and I knew it was true even as the words left my mouth. "You can't go back." The thing that had once been human made a sound that might have been a sob. "No," it agreed. "I can't go back. But I can remember, just for a little while. I can pretend." We stood there in silence for several minutes, predator and prey caught in a moment of strange understanding. I could see the intelligence in those dark hollows, the remnants of a human mind trapped in something that was no longer human. "What's your name?" I asked finally. It considered the question for a long time before answering. I think it was David. David something. The last name is gone, but I remember David." "David," I repeated, and the thing that had been David straightened slightly, as if hearing its name spoken aloud had given it some small measure of its lost humanity back. "Yes," it said. "I was David. I had a job, and a dog, and I liked to hike in the mountains. I remember that much." The fire crackled between us, and I found myself in the surreal position of having a conversation with something that should have been trying to kill me. But David seemed content to simply stand there, basking in the warmth and the illusion of human contact. "You should leave," David said eventually. "In the morning, you should pack your things and go back to your life. Don't come back to these woods." "Why?" I asked, though I already knew I would follow his advice. "Because there are others like me out there," he said. "Others who got lost and made the same choice I did. But they've been changed longer, forgotten more of what they used to be. They don't remember how to talk anymore, don't remember that they were ever human. They just remember hunger and cold and the need to feed." "Feed on what?" David's head tilted again, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of infinite sadness. "On whatever warmth they can find. On whatever humanity they can steal from others. On whatever might help them remember, even for a moment, what they've lost." The implications of his words hit me like a physical blow. "You mean They take people," David confirmed. "Not to kill them, not exactly. But to absorb their warmth, their life, their humanity. And in the process, they create more like themselves. More lost souls wandering the deep woods, forgetting more of what they were with each passing season." I gripped the poker tighter. "Is that what you were going to do to me?" David was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," he said finally. "I came here because I remembered warmth, remembered what it was like to be human. But when I saw you through the window, I felt something else too. Hunger. Need. The desire to take what you have and make it mine." "But you didn't?" "No," he agreed. "Because talking to you, being in this warm place, it's helping me remember. For the first time in however long it's been, I feel almost human again. Almost like David." The fire was beginning to die down, and I automatically reached for another log. David watched me feed the flames, his approximation of a face showing something that might have been longing. "I should go," he said. "Before the hunger gets stronger than the memory. Before I forget why I shouldn't take what you have." "Where will you go?" "Back to the deep woods. Back to wandering. Maybe I'll remember tonight for a while, remember what it felt like to be warm and human. Maybe that will be enough." David moved toward the broken doorway, then paused. "There's something else you should know," he said. "This cabin, it's not the first time I've been here." My blood went cold. "What do you mean?" "The old man who owns it, Ernest Whitmore. He's been bringing people here for years. City people, stressed people, people looking to get away from it all. He tells them the same things he told you, that it's peaceful, that they'll be safe, don't mind the sounds at night." "You're saying he knows about you? About the others?" "He knows," David confirmed. "He made the same choice I did, long ago. But he's learned to control it better, learned to feed in smaller amounts so he can still pass for human. He brings people here, and we take a little from each one. Not enough to kill them, usually, but enough to sustain us." The room seemed to spin around me. "That's impossible." I talked to him on the phone. He seemed completely normal. "He's had decades to practice," David said. "But if you look closely, you'll see the signs. The way his voice doesn't quite match his appearance. The way he never quite meets your eyes. The way he always seems to know things he shouldn't know." I thought back to my conversation with Ernest, trying to remember details. Had there been something off about his voice? Had he said things that seemed to indicate more knowledge than he should have had? "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because I remember being human," David replied. "And because you reminded me what it feels like to have a choice. Ernest has been doing this for so long that he's forgotten he has a choice. He's forgotten that feeding on others isn't the only way to survive." "What other way is there?" David's bark-like features shifted into what might have been a smile. "I'm going to find out," he said. "I'm going to walk deeper into the woods than I've ever gone before. I'm going to find the source of what changed us, and I'm going to see if there's a way to undo it. And if there isn't? Then at least I'll die remembering." Hey everyone, thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like and subscribe button, and then share with your friends. Your support helps us grow and create even more awesome content. We appreciate you being part of the journey. Here are a couple more videos for you to check out.